Hi, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're going to look at the difference between the MPPT, which is the maximum power point tracking, and PWM, pulse width modulation. I'm going to explain to you what the differences between them are, why it matters to you, which ones will work best for you, and this could save you a ton of solar energy if you get the right one. All right, let's get right to it. Let's look at what they actually are. So they are exactly as their names describe. The maximum power point tracking, which is the MPPT, is exactly that. It is tracking of the power when you have your power coming in from your solar panels as the sun goes up and down. It is tracking the maximum point that it can pull at any given time during this day, and it's pulling out the maximum amount of energy, taking that, converting it down, and sending it into your batteries. Whereas PWM, this power, this pulse, the pulse width modulation is doing exactly the opposite. It's taking this power as it comes in, and it's basically trimming it down to whatever voltage it needs to pass it into your battery, cutting out that upper thing. There are benefits to both. There are downsides to both. So we're going to break into those ups and downs and see if we can figure out some of this. There's a lot of confusion between the two of these in that they are the same or that they both work. There's even companies out there selling PWM on Amazon that I have seen where the name of the company is very similar to these four letters. This is simply just not acceptable, but it's causing so much confusion in the market simply because people don't understand the difference. So let me explain the difference to you, and then you'll be able to identify them and get the right one for your case scenario. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with MPPT. The MPPT is the maximum power point tracking. So let's assume that you have a 42 volt solar panel and you have a 12 volt battery. Solar panel. Now, that means that when you have a 42 volt, I'm going to put some voltage up here. When you have a 42 volt panel like this, you're basically going to see the power fluctuate across this grid as the day goes by. And what you will see is as this power moves from one to another, like this, as the sun goes down, the sun comes back up, gets really bright, stays there for a while, and then comes back down, you're going to see that what the MPPT is going to do is at any given time in this cycle, for example, if it takes a snapshot here, it's going to pull this voltage at 41 volts, and it's going to take the number of amps, and let's say that there's 10 amps coming in. 10 amps at 41 or 40.1 volts, so if it's 40.1 volts, would convert that into 10 amps would be 401 watts. Now, this 401 watts would then be converted down to 12 volts, and 12 volts at that same, sorry, I stepped away and get a calculator for this one. So 12 volts at that same 401 watts is what it's going to do, is it's going to convert it down from this 40.1 volts, and it's going to convert it down to 12 volts. And when it does such, that would basically convert into 401 divided by 12 volts, and you would get 33.4 amps at 12 volts. So this becomes it does a conversion from 40.1 volts at 401, at 10 amps, whoops, put that in the right thing, to 12 volts at 33.4. It's the same amount of wattage. It's just the controller is smart enough to sense where that maximum point of power is, and it tracks it as this goes up and down. So as the sun goes up and it gets into 42 volts here, so now you're at 42 volts, and let's say that you're running at the same 10 amps, now you're getting 420 watts, and the 420 watts at 12 volts, 420 at 12 volts would get converted to 35 amps, and that would go out to your batteries at 12 volts. So it is just a very smart piece of software that tracks this maximum power that it can extract. Now, it's a bit more complicated than this. And what I mean by that is that in order for it to know where this maximum is, you'll notice on a solar panel, there's two voltages. There's the open circuit voltage. So let's just say open circuit, and it may say something like 47. And then there's the operating voltage, and it may say something like we do here, where we said it was going to be 42 volts. Now what that means is that somewhere between here and here, when the MPPT goes to pull that voltage from it, it's going to pull down as much as it can to get the maximum amount of wattage that it can. Now it may be able to get different wattages at different points. So for example, it may be very easy for it to pull down here at 38 volts and get, let's say, 210 watts. And here at 39 volts, it may get 310 watts. And here at 39.8 or 39.8, it may get 400 watts. But what would happen is when it picks that perfect amount, and in this case it's 401, this is where it's going to actually pull that from, and it has to be smart enough to adjust for that each and every time. So as you can see, the software in an MPPT is much more complicated than just going in, grabbing the solar, converting it to the battery, and sending it on. It's got to be smart enough to find the right point that it is, and you can actually see this on a Victron charge controller, where it pings between the least amount of voltage that it can send to the battery and the highest amount of voltage that it can send to the battery, and determines where it's going to actually make that point for this particular instance, and it'll adjust that accordingly as it goes along as it needs to. So this software has to be smart enough to, one, go in and find the right voltage to get the maximum amount of wattage, and then two, it has to be able to convert that wattage, to downstep that wattage into the correct voltage for the battery's charging, depending on what kind of battery you have. And if that is like a lithium iron phosphate battery, then of course you're going to want that at a different rate than you would in a lead acid. So you'll need to adjust that. But it'll adjust that to exactly the correct amount to be able to push the maximum amount it can into that battery at that point, or to supply the maximum it can to the devices that are using it and reading from it. That is how MPPT works. Now, okay, so we take PWM, pulse width modulation, and explain how this works. And technically, it is exactly as it says. It is, and we'll start off very slow here, because what's going to basically say is, let's say that we have a battery that is sitting at 12 volts, and you have solar panels that are sitting at 14 volts. Now, those solar panels are obviously going to have different voltages, whether that be 12 volts, 13 volts, or 14 volts, or anywhere in between. And they're going to, just like before, the sun is going to come up, and the sun is going to go down, and you're going to have a variance in this voltage as the sun moves. Now, as the sun moves, what the pulse width modulation does is it cuts this off at every point in this bracket to 12 volts for the 12 volt battery. And it will basically cut off the top. Now you ask, how does it cut off the top? And I'm going to explain it to you. The PWM, pulse width modulation, means exactly that. So if you broke this power down into hundreds of milliseconds, and you had second 1 here and second 2 here, this power runs across like this, creating that voltage at, let's say, 13 volts. And what you want to do is you want to get it down to 12 volts. So your goal voltage here is this 12 volt line. So what it does is that in little micro pulses, it cuts the voltage off like this. And so your electricity in your power in here actually dips to 0 and then comes back up, and then dips to 0 and comes back up, and dips to 0 and comes back up. Just like this. Now, keeping in mind, this is 1 second, and this is doing it thousands, if not millions of times in a second in order to regulate that voltage and thus bring you down to 12 volts, or what would be perceived as 12 volts by the device. Now, as you can see, the big difference here is, and this is where you will hear that this is not as efficient as the MPPT. It's also not as expensive. They're easier to make, and they operate really well when you have solar panels that are very, very close to the voltage of what you want to charge, because a PWM charger is very inexpensive. But you're going to have to be very close, because what's going to happen is it's just going to trim this power off. So let's say you have power coming in at 13. Let's do it with a different color here. You have power coming in at 13 volts, and you want to trim it to 12, and you have 10 amps at 13 volts. That means that you have 130 watts of power coming in. But because you're going to do this modulation of the power and bring it down to 12, that means that you're going to trim off this and make this 10 amps at 12 volts, and you're only going to end up with 120 watts. So there will be a loss of 10 watts here in this modulation of this power as it does it. Now, if your panels are actually putting out, so let's say 10 amps at 18 volts, and you're getting 180 watts, if you were to put that into an MPPT, you would get 180 watts. But because you're running on a PWM, you've got 10 amps at 12 volts, and you're going to get 120 watts. Keeping in mind that this 120 and this 120 are the same. In other words, you need to be at this voltage or above, but anything above is wasted. So putting your panels in series and in upping the voltage is not going to do you the benefits that it would with an MPPT. With an MPPT, you'd put them in series, you bring that voltage up, you make the losses less, and then you bring that voltage down and you convert it as opposed to trim it. That's the basic difference between the two. The PWM is going to trim that voltage off, thus you have the power loss of what they're producing. The MPPT is going to take that voltage and convert it, but it is much more complicated and expensive to do that. And it allows you, the electronics and the software involved in doing so is a lot more complicated, and that's why the devices cost so much more. Talk about use cases of the MPPT versus the PWM. The MPPT is on any large system where you need to parallel panels to get it up, to get the power up in order to transfer it. It would be very unpractical in a PWM system if you were running, let's say, 12-volt system or a 24-volt system, to go out and find a whole bunch of panels that exactly fit that voltage to where you could parallel them. So let's talk about it. Down here, you might have a 12-volt system where you're just running a couple of little lights, you're in a van, you've got a couple of 100-watt panels on the roof, they both run at 12 volts, you would run them in parallel, and that would get you to at 100 watts. That would get you, your 200 watts, or just barely right at 200 watts if it had to trim it down a little bit. This is a very good use case for PWM. In the case of a large system where you're going to run a house, where you may have 31 panels at, let's say, 400 watts, and when you have 31 panels at 400 watts, you've got, wow, that is what, 12,400 watts of power. What you're not going to want to do is you're not going to want to parallel these out, because the amperage from this, even if each of these panels was running at 10 amps, would be 300. Wow, it would be a lot. It would be 310 amps of power coming in if you had these paralleled like you would over here. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to run these in series, most likely series of 10 or 15 at a time. Even 10 at a time, you would get 3 strings of 10. You would have much reduced thing. They would run at about 4,000 watts a piece. 4,000 watts a piece would be very, very easy for you to manage on 3 different strings coming in, and that would allow you, the MPPT, to adjust that down to the correct battery voltage, or run it directly into an inverter and send it back to the grid. So these are basically the 2 use cases. Somewhere in this line, this gray line here, is where you need to figure out where your system falls. Do you need to switch from the very inexpensive PWM to the more expensive MPPT? Here is my advice. Always go with the MPPT if you can. There is only one really good use case that I know of for a PWM. This is a very small system where you're running a 12-volt system. You have panels that are matched very well, and you're very, very cost restricted, and you need a very super cheap charger. That would be the only real use case that I can see. This technology is pretty much seen its day, and everything is going to MPPT, especially with the cost of products going down. You can get a very good MPP Victron, nice, great charge controller now for $60 or $70 that will do pretty much anything that these will do. And that is the conclusion here, is that the key difference is the bigger systems, the better management, the better software, usually the Bluetooth devices that connect to them that manage them better, the direct conversion of the power, the more efficient, but the slightly more expensive, versus the very simplistic, very difficult in larger systems to configure correctly, very restrictive on how you set up the panels, and very limited in what they're capable of doing for the PWM. Not that this can't be done. It was done for years before the MPPT came out. It just was much more complicated and more difficult to do. That said, I hope this has been helpful to you. I want to encourage you to like and subscribe to the channel, and like this video, subscribe to the channel. And if you're interested in this type of stuff, I would encourage you to take a look at this video right here. It's got some great stuff on building a basic solar system, and it's very, very easy. It's only 5 minutes.